Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn Supreme Capture, how the far right packed our Supreme Court and what we can do about it. Polluters and their far right allies have co-opted our nation's highest court, and they're using it to pursue an extremist agenda that threatens our environment, our democracy, and so much more. We need to fix it. Here with us today to explore possible solutions are Katie O'Connor, Deputy Chief Counsel at Demand Justice, and Doug Lindner, Advocacy Director for Judiciary and Democracy at the League of Conservation Voters. My name is Will Sedlak. I am not Kathleen Meal, as you've probably surmised, and I know many are at the climate conference today and will be watching this on YouTube later, but it's delightful to be here with you. I am the Program Manager at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to protecting Maine's environment and our democracy. MCA does that through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. A few technical notes for today's event. We will hear first from our speakers and then tackle your questions in the Q&A session at the end. You do not have to wait though. Please send your questions to me through the chat as they occur to you. I'll keep track of those questions, compile them, collate them, and ask those questions during the presentation at the end. We ask that you not message Doug and Katie during the presentation directly, as we want their focus on the presentation, not on the chat box. Please message our fabulous summer fellow, Tara Gallo, if you have any technical questions. She's filling in for me today. And this event is being recorded, and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon, along with recordings of all of our previous Lunch and Learns, including some exceptional ones from this year on the Supreme Court and our court system in general. Thank you all for joining us. I believe, Katie, I'm turning this over to you first, so kick it off. Thank you all.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Will and Tara and Doug, for asking me to do this. I'm excited to be here with you all today, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So my name is Katie O'Connor. I'm the Deputy Chief Counsel at Demand Justice, and I'm here today to share with you all how the courts are rigged against us and how we can fix it. So I will start with the problem. The problem is that the Supreme Court is way out of touch with the American people. It is increasingly conservative and increasingly ideological, and that is in large part by design. So the Supreme Court has been under Republican appointed control for the past 50 years, even though the Democratic candidate has won the presidential election, won the popular vote of the presidential election in 7 of 8 of the past elections. And a majority of the current justices on the court were confirmed by Senate majorities that represented a minority of the American population. And we got here, as I said, by design. You know, Senate Republicans have abandoned a lot of their policy priorities to the extent that they had policy priorities in order to install a conservative Supreme Court majority. They broke all the norms and conventions to get to this place. So this has been happening for at least a decade, but it really sort of accelerated in 2016 when Majority Leader McConnell refused to even grant a hearing to President Obama's pick to succeed Antonin Scalia on the Supreme Court. So Merrick Garland, his nomination floundered for almost a year as Republicans refused to meet with him or give him a hearing. And then as soon as Donald Trump was elected and became president, Neil Gorsuch was swiftly confirmed onto the court. That was unprecedented and started what would become sort of a pattern during the Trump administration. 2 years later, Kennedy retired and Brett Kavanaugh was nominated. And the Republican Senate sort of did the same, fast lane process to get him confirmed. What we saw with Brett Kavanaugh was what you all probably remember, which is, sweeping under the rug credible allegations from multiple people of sexual assault. But also we saw that, the Trump administration with the assistance of the George W. Bush, with the past George W. Bush administration, refusing to give access to a lot of Brett Kavanaugh's records from his time in the George W. Bush White House, and he was confirmed in somewhat record time. But then the sort of piece de resistance for this was in 2020 when Ruth Bader Ginsburg unfortunately passed away shortly before the 2020 election. Amy Coney Barrett was nominated to succeed her, and her confirmation process was unprecedentedly quick, and it ended with her confirmation vote just a couple days before the 2020 election concluded, and it was after 60 million Americans had already voted. So now we have a 6-3 Republican supermajority that was obtained through, breaking all the rules and breaking all the norms, and now it consistently puts ideology and partisan interests above the law. So the court is vastly out of step with everyday Americans. One good sort of measure of this is that the court now sides with the Chamber of Commerce in 70% of the cases in which the chamber files briefs. The court also is regularly sort of subverting rights that most Americans hold dear. So what we saw last year with the subversion of abortion rights in Texas, but what we're about to see with the likely overturning of Roe versus Wade, even though Roe versus Wade and abortion rights are consistently and overwhelmingly popular with the American people. The court has also hobbled gun violence prevention measures, even though an overwhelming majority of Americans want to institute gun violence prevention measures in order to address the gun violence epidemic this country faces. And finally, the court is preventing states and the federal government from effectively addressing climate change, even though consistent majorities of the American public want to see climate change addressed in meaningful ways. But I think what is more concerning to me about what the Supreme Court is doing right now is that it's rigging the rules of the game in order to further entrench Republican control of all wings of the government. So the court has in large part become part of the Republican Party's agenda to maintain minority control. As I just went over, it was installed in plainly anti-democratic ways, the 6-3 conservative majority that is. But it also consistently rules to further entrench GOP power in the other branches of government. For instance, it a few years ago sort of greenlit partisan gerrymandering. It's that the federal courts have no basis to intervene and to strike down as unconstitutional what are becoming more and more extreme partisan gerrymandering plans. The court has been on a decade-long crusade to eviscerate the Voting Rights Act starting in 2013 when it struck down Section 5. But just last year, it pretty severely weakened Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And what we expect is that in the upcoming term that starts in October, it will sort of deal the fatal blow to the Voting Rights Act. It's also weakened the National Voter Registration Act, which is supposed to make it easier for Americans to get registered to vote. And what we all know too well is that it has allowed corporate money to just flood our elections. So the court is making it more difficult for Democrats to win elections by eroding the right to vote, by rigging the rules of the game. And then even when Democrats win, we see that Republicans obstruct. What we also know the Supreme Court is likely to do, already has done, but likely to continue to do is to make it very difficult for progressive legislation to make it past the Supreme Court's muster. So we see Congress coming up with some really good legislative fixes to a lot of the serious problems we have. So Women's Health Protection Act, the Green New Deal, and other environmental laws, gun violence prevention measures like the ones that are being passed in Congress right now, as well as laws to address income inequality, including increased minimum wage and stuff like that. All of these pieces of legislation are at serious risk in front of this 6-3 Supreme Court. But as I said, it's not all doom and gloom. There are some solutions, and we hope that you all, and we know that LCV is going to be helping us get those solutions in front of Congress as quickly as we can. So, one of the easiest things we can do right now is to make sure that the Biden administration fills every lower court vacancy with professionally diverse judges who understand the needs of everyday Americans. And I'm going to say more about that and more about all of these on coming slides. We can also seek to have the lower courts expanded so that there are more seats to be filled by really good progressive judges. We can impose term limits on Supreme Court justices and enact ethics reform to address Supreme Court justice, the behavior of Supreme Court justices. And finally, we can expand the Supreme Court. So the lower courts haven't been expanded this includes district courts and circuit courts, the two levels of courts that are below the Supreme Court. And they haven't been expanded in a comprehensive way in over 30 years, even though the population and the caseload have expanded significantly. So I think the population has expanded about 33% since the last time the lower courts were expanded. And the caseload, the average caseload for these courts and for these judges has increased by about 38%. So this would just be a good governance measure. The courts have backlogs. It takes a long time for cases to get through. They need more judges, and this should be an easy thing to get through Congress. Unfortunately, it's not, because everything is political, but this is a good governance measure. But it's also an opportunity for President Biden to continue his really great track record of nominating and having confirmed demographically and professionally diverse judicial nominees. So just as a few examples, 60% of Biden's nominees are professionally diverse. And by that, I mean that they come from backgrounds that are relatively unrepresented on the federal bench. For instance, they're public defenders, or they're civil rights lawyers, environmental lawyers, labor lawyers. For decades, we've seen an overrepresentation of corporate attorneys and prosecutors on the bench, and Biden has done a lot to bring balance back to the bench. But he's also done a great job with demographic diversity, nominating 65% of his nominees are people of color, and 75% of nominees are women. And that's better than any president, but especially great coming after Trump, who had a really abysmal track record on diversity on the bench. There are also a number of ways to reform the Supreme Court. So Supreme Court justices are the only members of the federal judiciary. There are about 900 federal judges in this country, and the 9 Supreme Court justices are the only ones that are not bound by a code of ethics. That's why we see things like, Justice Clarence Thomas participating in cases that implicate the January 6th insurrection, that implicate the efforts to overturn the election, that directly implicate his wife. He can do that because there is no code of ethics to which he is bound. There are a number of pieces of legislation that are in Congress right now that would address that, and we are supportive of all of them. We also, at Demand Justice, are big supporters of the idea of term limits. Term limits for Supreme Court justices has been a popular idea for a long time. Supreme Court justices serve for life, so there are virtually no consequences for their misconduct like that of Clarence Thomas participating in cases where he has serious conflicts of interest. But the uncertainty of lifetime tenure also makes every vacancy sort of an all-out war between the parties, as we saw in 2016 with Neil Gorsuch, in 2018 with Brett Kavanaugh, and in 2020 with Amy Coney Barrett. So term limits would be a great way of sort of lowering the temperature on these confirmation battles and bringing some stability to the Supreme Court. But what we see as the most urgent and And the most important reform for the Supreme Court is to add 4 seats immediately. You know, adding seats would create an opportunity to make the court look more like America. We just had confirmed the first Black woman to the Supreme Court ever, and that is so exciting. And we would love to see the Supreme Court opened up to more people who look more like the American public. You know, adding 4 seats would bring us to 13, which also is important historically because the number of justices has almost always corresponded with the number of circuits that we have. And right now we do have 13 circuits. So that would be, that would make sense historically. But it would also allow the court to hear more cases. What's surprising is that the court is hearing fewer cases now than it has in past decades by significant numbers. Supreme Court expansion is constitutional, so it's been done 7 times in the past, and there's no question that it's constitutional, that it's within Congress's power to set the number of justices on the Supreme Court. It's also the idea is very popular and becoming more so, especially as we see the court doing things that are further and further from what the American public really wants to see from the court. So as of right now, roughly 50% of voters support Supreme Court expansion and nearly 80% of Democrats support it. And that number is ticking up every day. What we'll see in the next couple of weeks is some really awful decisions. I think Doug's gonna get to those in his presentation, but I expect the popularity of the idea of Supreme Court expansion to continue going up as this Supreme Court continues to do more and more extreme things. Finally, Supreme Court expansion is urgent and essential. It is the only thing that would address the very immediate threat that this court poses to the rights that we hold dear and the ability of our state and federal governments to address the issues that we know are so critical to be addressed, like climate change, like gun violence. So we want to see a Supreme Court that allows the government to function the way that it should, and that allows the American government and state governments to do what we know needs to be done to make this a more livable place. So I will just end with saying, you know, Supreme Court expansion is possible. Everything feels a little bit impossible right now because of how dysfunctional Congress is, but as I mentioned a minute ago, there's no question that Supreme Court expansion is within the power of Congress. And actually there is already legislation that's been introduced that would do just this. It would add 4 seats to the Supreme Court. So it's called the Judiciary Act of 2021. It's been introduced in both chambers of Congress. There are now 57 House co-sponsors and 3 Senate co-sponsors. And there are going to be plenty of upcoming opportunities to gain more co-sponsors. I would encourage you all to be watching the Supreme Court over the next 2 weeks as it finishes up its term. Each one of these cases that comes down, which we expect to be pretty devastating to a lot of our rights, are opportunities to get more members of Congress to endorse this legislation, to endorse the idea that we need to add seats to the Supreme Court in order to address the very immediate threat that it poses to us and our rights and our democracy. So I'm going to end there. I'm going to hand it over to Doug, but this is my email address, and demandjustice.org is our website. We would love for you all to check us out, and then I look forward to answering some questions in a few minutes, and thank you.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm going to share my screen and we will get started on the next phase of the presentation. Okay, I think everyone should be able to see what I'm doing here. If not, I will put that on Will or Katie to tell me that, and therefore it's their fault if you can't see it. Okay, so.
We can see it, so I am absolved of all liability.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about why the captured Supreme Court is such a big problem for our environment. I want to start by saying we at LCV support all the solutions that Katie was just talking about, including and especially both expanding the Supreme Court, expanding the lower courts, and making sure that we are confirming personally and professionally diverse pro-environment, pro-democracy judges to courts at all levels. I'm going to focus here a little bit more on why environmentalists need to care about this, in addition to folks who care a lot about issues like reproductive rights and civil rights that I think we tend to hear more about when we think about the Supreme Court. But as we get started here, I'm moving that little box off of my main screen. I want to start with a quick primer. Let's do this. Ready?
When corporations have a choice between more profits and less pollution, too many choose more profits. Environmental laws are only as strong as the judges who enforce them. We need good judges to hold polluters accountable. The future of our planet is in their court.
Okay, so that's the short version, but let's get into the...
When corporations...
Nope, not playing the same video again. Next slide. Okay, so why do courts matter to the environment? Environmental law is one of the most complex areas of law in the United States. And that is true both because there are a lot of sources of law, federal, state, and local, but also because laws like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, which are about 50 years old, are just particularly complex in themselves. And there are so many important cases that affect the environment in so many large and small ways. And so making sure that we have a court that both understands these issues and that cares about protecting our environment and making sure that we have a livable future and a healthy environment and habitat for ourselves is super important, particularly in this era when we have a Supreme Court that is not super invested in those things. It's also worth keeping in mind that administrative law generally, even when it's not specific to the environment, will affect the environment because administrative law governs how agencies like the EPA can operate. And so when we see cases like one that the Supreme Court decided last week about legal doctrines like Chevron deference, which have to do with whether or not agencies like the EPA can use their expertise to interpret statutes that Congress passes for them to administer. These are things that are super important even when they do not have, climate or the environment in the headline. And of course, on this, like every other issue, courts have the power to interpret, apply, uphold, and strike down these laws. And environmental laws are only as strong as the judges who enforce them and uphold them. So thinking about which courts matter. Certainly the United States Supreme Court is the big one. It's the one we're talking about mostly here, but a lot of other courts matter to the environment as well. The United States Court of Appeals for the DC Circuit, the second most powerful court in America, as it's frequently called, gets that name because it has so much power over federal administrative agencies in particular. And so when the EPA promulgates a regulation, for example, that will very frequently go before the DC Circuit before it gets to the Supreme Court. And so confirming great judges to the DC Circuit, like Michelle Childs, who is a current nominee there, is super important to make sure that when the EPA does its job under administrations that want it to do its job, that those regulations actually go into effect and that they are able to do the things they need to do. Other federal courts also matter a huge amount to this, especially other federal appeals courts, courts like the Ninth Circuit, which includes California, Alaska, and much of the Western United States. So much land there, so much public land in particular. 22% of the land in the United States is owned by the federal government, and the bulk of that is either in the West or in Alaska. And so courts that decide what we can do on public lands, whether there will be fossil fuel extraction or not, whether they will be preserved for future generations, those are really important issues. And of course, on private lands as well. District courts, other federal courts, and state courts also super important to this, including state high courts. Y'all in Maine have a better system than most in that your governor appoints judges to your state high court, but in most states, those judges are elected frequently in increasingly partisan battles for those courts. And those courts have enormous power over our environment, over our democracy, and over other issues. All courts matter, and it's really important to be paying attention to those. Again, not just the US Supreme Court, but also lower federal courts and state courts. So what is the Supreme Court currently doing about our environment? We talked a little bit about West Virginia v. EPA. That is the case the court is currently considering, which could be decided as soon as Tuesday, but we expect it will happen at some point, probably by the end of this month. That is one in which the Supreme Court is considering taking away the federal government's most important authority to fight climate change, which is the ability of the EPA under the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gases from power plants. Seems like a pretty important environmental authority, right? Regulating greenhouse gases from power plants, but that is on the line. And it is on the line, even though the Supreme Court has already said the EPA can do that. And we'll get more into how we got to this point on that soon. A little further down the line, a few months from now, on October 3rd, actually, the Supreme Court will hear oral arguments in a case called Sackett versus EPA. And just like West Virginia is a threat to the Clean Air Act, Sackett is a threat to the Clean Water Act, maybe even a bigger threat to the Clean Water Act, because it could severely narrow which waters are subject to the Clean Water Act. So instead of including, a bunch of wetlands, the Supreme Court might say that the Clean Water Act, for example, could only apply to navigable waters where boats can navigate, which would severely narrow the application of that and threaten not only our wildlife, but also our own clean drinking water for ourselves. So that oral argument is coming at the beginning of October, right as we get into the midterm. And hopefully folks will see that happening and understand how big a threat that is to us as well as to our environment. And of course, at the same time those things are happening, the Supreme Court is threatening our democracy. They are striking down voting rights, as Katie talked about. They are striking down campaign finance laws. They are upholding voter suppression and upholding gerrymandering. And all those things coalesce and come together because no one benefits more from undermining democracy than the fossil fuel industry, which is a threat to authoritarians all around the world. So let's go back a little bit. We're in 2007, 15 years ago. The most important environmental case then, or maybe ever at the Supreme Court up until now, was called Massachusetts versus EPA. This is a situation in which George W. Bush is president, and because his administration was in the pocket of the fossil fuel industry and not friendly to our environment, the Bush administration EPA was deciding to take essentially no action on climate, and certainly their EPA did not want to regulate greenhouse gases from power plants. So Massachusetts and a dozen other states sued the EPA, sued the Bush administration, and said fossil fuel plants have carbon emissions into the air that causes climate change. That is air pollution. We have the Clean Air Act. Maybe the EPA should regulate greenhouse gases from power plants. The Bush administration didn't want to and argued that they couldn't. The Supreme Court at the time, which was then a 5-4 conservative court, ruled that not only could the EPA regulate greenhouse gases from power plants, but that the EPA must do that, that is required of them by the Clean Air Act. And I've listed who the justices were in the majority and the dissent in that case, because that is part of the story. So the 4 at the time liberal justices, plus Justice Kennedy, the center-right justice, were in the majority, and 4 conservative justices were in dissent: Roberts, Scalia, Thomas, and Alito. And you'll notice Chief Justice Roberts, as well as Justices Thomas and Alito, are still on the Supreme Court. Kennedy, Stevens, Souter, and Ginsburg are not, and Justice Breyer will be retiring to be succeeded by Ketanji Brown Jackson probably within the next few weeks or months. So then this guy comes into office, and that changes everything, because we go from having a president who was not a friend to the environment to one who is. And we also, at that same time in 2008, elected a pro-environment, pro-democracy Congress, and that comes with new developments in this story. So President Obama nominated and appointed climate champions to key positions, including administrator of the EPA. Obama and Democrats in Congress made historic investments in climate and clean energy through the Recovery Act, including, for example, the Recovery Act funded the loan that paid for Tesla's first factory to make the Model S their first mass-produced sedan, which was repaid in full to the federal government with interest. But that is how electric vehicles started taking off in a big way. They tried very hard to pass a cap-and-trade bill called Waxman-Markey, which would have been the most significant climate legislation ever passed in Congress. It did pass the House, and it got, I believe it had the support of something like 57 senators, but it fell a little bit short of 60 because there were a few, unfortunately, Democrats from fossil fuel states who were not on board with that. But the Obama administration went on to promulgate a regulation known as the Clean Power Plan. This was the first effort by the federal government to regulate greenhouse gases from those power plants, as the Supreme Court had said they needed to in 2007. So they put this regulation forward. This is the most ambitious climate regulation in American history, the most ambitious climate plan in American history. And around the same time, President Obama negotiated and joined the most ambitious global climate change agreement ever reached, the Paris Climate Accords, with the intention of meeting America's commitments in large part with the Clean Power Plan. But then the Clean Power Plan got held up in court. Meanwhile, at the United States Supreme Court, President Obama appointed Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan to succeed Justice Souter and Justice Stevens, but that did not change the ideological makeup of the court. It was still a 5-4 conservative court, with Justice Kennedy being the swing vote. Not that he swung to the left much, but occasionally he did, including on Massachusetts versus EPA. Obama also appointed over 300 judges to the lower federal courts. Those are folks who have life tenure and are really important to this day and for decades to come in protecting our environment and our democracy. But during the Obama era, the Supreme Court also decided Citizens United v. FEC, which opened the floodgates to an avalanche of, not to mix my metaphors here, but created a lot more dark money and unlimited undisclosed and disclosed money in our politics, and affecting our judicial nominations of judicial elections in the state level, which of course massively benefits the fossil fuel industry. For example, we started hearing a lot about the Koch brothers and that family after Citizens United because they were spending so much money in order to influence our elections and influence our courts. The reason that the Koch brothers and their family were spending so much money on our elections and on our courts is that that family controls the nation's largest privately held oil company, and they expect reasonably a financial return on their investment. And it's not just them; they are the tip of the melting iceberg. But when our democracy is weakened, the fossil fuel industry benefits, especially in this particular way. And then, having undermined campaign finance law quite a bit, the Supreme Court ruled in Shelby County v. Holder. They struck down the heart of the Voting Rights Act, which, as Katie said, they are continuing to chip away at the Voting Rights Act. It is not completely gone yet, but it's getting there. And after the Supreme Court did that, Republicans in the states, state legislators, governors, and election officials, secretaries of state, county clerks, began a wave of voter suppression unseen since Jim Crow, which is continuing not just to happen, but to accelerate in 2022, especially in light of the big lie from 2020, and has grown beyond voter suppression to election sabotage and subversion as well. And of course, the Supreme Court is continuing to attack voting rights while that's happening. So then we get to 2016. Justice Antonin Scalia dies in office in February of that year, while President Obama has 11 months left of his term. President Obama nominates Merrick Garland to that seat, one of the most respected, qualified judges in America. At the time, he was the chief judge of the DC Circuit, the second most powerful court in the country. But even before President Obama nominated Merrick Garland, the same day Justice Scalia died, just hours after the announcement, Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader at the time, announced that the Republican-controlled Senate would neither consider having a hearing or a vote on any nominee for President Obama because 11 months out from the election, he thought that was too close, and he said the American people should have a say. So that was the longest Supreme Court nomination in American history. It went nowhere. Merrick Garland's nomination to the Supreme Court expired at the end of President Obama's term, as McConnell intended. And then I think we all know what happened next. This guy. So President Trump comes into office, and of course at that time Republicans continue to control the Senate, they control the House, and they are not friends of the environment. So President Trump, like President Bush, was not big on climate, not big on our environment, but is big on rewarding the fossil fuel interests who supported his election and those of his allies in Congress and in the states. So President Trump's EPA withdraws the Obama Clean Power Plan. They try to replace it with a toothless regulation, to make it harder for a future pro-environment administration to restore something like the Clean Power Plan. That Trump EPA rule got struck down by the DC Circuit for violating the Clean Air Act the day before President Biden was inaugurated. So there is no current regulation of greenhouse gases from power plants, neither a good one nor a bad one. That regulation just is not in place. There isn't one right now. Trump also withdrew America from the Paris Climate Accords. And although the Trump administration did everything in its power to harm our environment, states and cities during that time continued to take climate action, and renewable energy continued to boom thanks to investments made under the Obama administration. And as a result, there was still some climate progress that happened during these years. However, at the same time, with help from Senate Republicans and polluter money, Trump appointed hundreds of right-wing judges with life tenure. I mentioned that President Obama appointed hundreds of judges, better judges during his time as well. But remember, President Obama served 2 terms and won the popular vote twice. Donald Trump served 1 term and lost the popular vote twice. And he appointed more than 70% of the number of judges that President Obama did. 1/3 of seats in the federal judiciary are now held by Trump appointees. And of course, near the end of his term, Trump tried to end the American experiment, which was not ideal. Meanwhile, at the Supreme Court, as Katie went through, Trump nominated Neil Gorsuch to succeed Justice Scalia. Senate Democrats filibustered because that was the seat that was stolen from President Obama. Senate Republicans changed the rules of the Senate to confirm Gorsuch with a simple majority, which is now how Supreme Court nominations work. Then, having said that February of an election year was too close to the election to confirm a Supreme Court justice when a Democrat was in office, Justice Kennedy retired in the summer of 2018. Trump nominated Brett Kavanaugh, despite his sexual assault allegations, unexplained debt payoffs by unknown parties, and his literally swearing vengeance against the Democratic Party under oath during his confirmation hearing. Senate Republicans confirmed Brett Kavanaugh after early voting began for the 2018 midterm, 1 month before Election Day. In 2020, Justice Ginsburg dies, and Trump nominated Amy Coney Barrett. This is in late September of that year at the height of COVID. You may remember that the announcement event for Justice Barrett was a super spreader event where it was possible that President Trump himself contracted COVID during that event. Senate Republicans ended up confirming Justice Barrett 1 week before Trump's expected loss in the presidential election after millions of votes had already been cast. And because now, instead of having a 5-4 conservative court where Anthony Kennedy was the median justice, we now have a 6-3 conservative court where Brett Kavanaugh, the guy who swore vengeance against the Democratic Party during his confirmation hearing, is the median justice, the swing vote on the court. Even John Roberts, who has repeatedly attacked our democracy and civil rights, is to the left of the median justice on the Supreme Court now. So that is the situation that we continue to have on the court, and one where, even though we, as Katie said, we have had a right-wing court for half a century, the most conservative court in living memory is the one we have right now and the one we have had since October of 2020. So then President Biden gets elected. And that, of course, changes things once again. It hasn't changed the court quite as much yet, but it does make other changes that are really important. So President Biden has rejoined the Paris Climate Accords. He has appointed climate champions to key positions. And in fact, he has prioritized that. He's even created some new positions within the White House for John Kerry, the former Secretary of State, to be America's climate envoy, and Gina McCarthy, the former EPA administrator, to be the National Climate Advisor, as well as pro-environment folks at the Justice Department and at the EPA. President Biden and Democrats in Congress have been and are still pushing for historic $555 billion investments in climate through budget reconciliation, which is the one process that allows legislation to pass through the Senate with a simple majority, which is very important because, as you all know, the Senate is currently evenly split 50-50 with Vice President Harris breaking the tie, so simple majority is very important. And the Biden EPA has not promulgated a new clean power plan yet. There is no regulation in place from the EPA regulating greenhouse gases from existing power plants. And I think it's probably the case that they are waiting for the Supreme Court to act in West Virginia v. EPA. So the court is still considering West Virginia v. EPA, which is, as we've said, a challenge to the EPA's authority to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act, even though the Supreme Court has already said the EPA can and must do that, even though the EPA is not currently trying to do that, even though the Supreme Court isn't supposed to rule in the absence of a live issue, because the Supreme Court is way to the right of where it was in 2007, even though that 2007 court was also extremely conservative. And as we mentioned at the top, they're also going to hear this case Sackett v. EPA that significantly could undermine the Clean Water Act in the court's next term starting in October. 5 months ago, Justice Thomas used his position on the court to try to cover up his wife's participation in the January 6th coup attempt. And on a better note, President Biden has appointed Ketanji Brown Jackson to succeed Justice Breyer. She is great, but because Justice Breyer is a Clinton appointee, this is not expected to change the ideological balance of the court. There will still be 6 conservative justices, and Brett Kavanaugh will still be the median justice. So why are they doing this? Why are they coming after our environment and our democracy? Because they can, because they're ideological extremists and they want to, because the polluters and far-right politicians who gave them their power want them to, because they have life tenure, and because they think no one's going to stop them. So what can you do about it? First, call Senator Angus King and ask him to co-sponsor the Judiciary Act to expand and rebalance the Supreme Court. Call Senator Susan Collins and ask her to support the many highly qualified Biden nominees for the lower federal courts, which actually, even though she's a Republican, she has a record of supporting qualified nominees for the federal courts from presidents of both parties, and I believe has supported a majority of President Biden's judicial nominees so far. So really important to make sure that she too understands how important it is for all these wonderful, highly qualified, brilliant, even-handed nominees to get confirmed. Keep pushing them and your representatives in the House to pass major climate investments through budget reconciliation this summer. Really important that that happen in the short term, not the long term, because as you may know, the midterm is not looking great for the Democrats and for pro-environment candidates. And so really important that we get those climate investments passed now this year while we still have a chance, and to help pro-environment, pro-democracy candidates win the midterm election. So that's all I got for you at the moment. Looking forward to taking your questions, and thank you for being here with us or for watching this later on YouTube.
Doug, Katie, thank you so much for that. I will just say, I think for those that are the regulars, and I see, my friend Dina on here and so many others on here, is that, you will notice, this is the fourth program related to the federal courts that MCV has done this year alone. We are now, 2.5 years into the Lunch and Learn program. Over 20,000 people have joined. There is a reason we keep doing programs on the federal courts. So much of our work here at MCV is focused on the state legislature. So much of LCV's work nationally is focused on Congress. It turns out that the Republicans really have figured out a way to end run the desire of citizens to act on climate, to protect human rights, and they've done that through the federal courts. And so I just want to reiterate, the call to action today. I'll need to put the slide up. Doug kind of addressed that already, but the first, and you will get this in the follow-up email, and again, I know somebody will be watching this later, you'll be getting this as well, is Senator Collins has a unique opportunity to influence the confirmation of federal judges. We know this. She's our senior senator. She has a track record of supporting judicial nominations, regardless of the party, the president who nominated them. But many highly qualified nominees are sitting and awaiting Senate votes right now. In the email this afternoon, you will find an action alert that allows you to easily email Senator Collins and let her know that you'd really like her to, that we need her. We need her voice to get these distinguished lawyers across the finish line and onto the bench. That's where their services are needed and their varied backgrounds are needed as we continue this American experiment, as Doug said. The other thing that we really do need you to do is email Senator King. Senator King also has a phenomenal track record on judicial confirmations, but we are asking more of him. And so without a deliberate rebalancing, the Supreme Court is positioned to continue to impose and expose our country, I guess, to some bad stuff and impose an extremist agenda on our country for a generation or generations to come. And we believe here at MCV, and I know LCV and Demand Justice also believe that the Judiciary Act offers a clear path forward for our country, and that adding 4 seats to the Supreme Court is a good idea for our country. And we believe that Senator King has the opportunity to sign on as a co-sponsor and believe that this is a good thing for him to do. And he needs to hear from you, and you need to let him know that you think it's a good thing for him to do. So again, this afternoon's email will have links for you to reach out to both Senator Collins and Senator King. And we just ask that you please do that. If you have questions, keep them coming, keep messaging. I can walk and chew gum, as it were, and read your questions as they're coming in. But I was hoping that both Katie and Doug, you could start with this code of ethics for the lower courts. Could you just, I think a lot about, as somebody that went to law school, as somebody that's married to a lawyer, as a sister that's a lawyer, is, so much of what was imparted in me in law school was, how you comport yourself, what you can and can't do. You obviously can't steal funds from your client. You can't do all these different things. You have to represent yourself as an officer of the court. It looks like we lost Doug. So Katie, Doug's back. What does a lower court judge, how do they have to comport themselves? Obviously, what does that look like? And what should we look for in a code of ethics for the Supreme Court? Doug or Katie, either.
So I will start with, so there is a federal law that requires judges and justices to recuse themselves when they have a conflict of interest among one of the parties in a case. The problem is there's no enforcement mechanism. So you can cite that law when you ask Justice Thomas to recuse himself, for instance, but there's no way to enforce it. As for lower courts, there is a code of ethics that regulates other stuff like financial conflicts of interest. So stuff outside of the idea of recusing from a case. It's about like how to avoid acting politically or speaking at political events, the kinds of travel that you can do, the audiences to whom you can speak. Those are all sort of regulated by a code of ethics for lower court judges, but it's all enforced within the judiciary. So judges look out for other judges, and there are several pieces of legislation that are being considered right now. I think the one that's most likely to be moving is in the House of Representatives. It's called the Supreme Court Ethics, Recusal and Transparency Act. And it would basically make the whole recusal process something that the American public can watch and see happen. So judges and justices would have to explain why they are or are not recusing from cases where there are potential conflicts. There would be a review process, so that if a justice says, I'm not going to recuse and here's why, there would be other judges or justices that would step in and review that to make sure that it's the right conclusion, and that it would make sure that all of this information is available to the American public. So there's that piece of legislation. There are several others. I will say the Clarence Thomas revelations that kind of keep coming are definitely keeping this issue alive. And so there is a possibility that Congress is going to address, at the very least, the need for a binding code of ethics on Supreme Court justices, but hopefully something more comprehensive that will bring accountability and transparency to justices and to lower court judges.
That feels like an awful lot of upside and very little downside. So am I missing something? Yeah.
I will just say this. It is, most people agree, it has not been a partisan issue in the past. What is making it a partisan issue right now is that Republicans are seeing it as a direct response to what's happening with Ginny and Clarence Thomas. So the substance of these pieces of legislation, everybody kind of agrees that the Supreme Court should be bound by a code of ethics. Everybody agrees that there should be more transparency into recusal decisions and other conflicts of interest. But the only holdup is that it's right now being seen as a direct attack on Clarence and Ginny Thomas. The timing is obviously no coincidence, but again, the substance of what Democrats are asking for here is substance that Republicans have agreed to in the past. So hopefully we can find some way to get some of this legislation passed, but that is at this point the hiccup.
Okay. I'm loving the questions we're getting here, and I think we must have somebody with a deep love of history on, because I have and I don't know which of you is perhaps the right one, but we're going to implicate Owen Roberts now. And I guess there's a question of how is this different from the moment in 1937 where, the switch in time that saved 9, FDR and the New Deal. I mean, this feels like to me as an observer and somebody that works on democracy issues, a fundamentally different moment in time. Norms have been broken. Either of you feel like that's a question you want to take on, or Doug, I saw you nodding, but
I'll weigh in really quickly and then let Doug. I just want to say one thing, to your point, I think it is different from the 30s and the switch in time save 9 because of how severely the process was broken down in order to get the 6-3 majority. But I think the other thing that really makes this different from what was happening in the 30s is that the Supreme Court is not just issuing opinions with which a majority of American people disagree. It's issuing opinions that chip away at our democratic functions. And so it is becoming sort of a direct threat to the health of our democracy itself.
Thank you. I think that, Go for it.
Sounds like you can hear me. I had some technical trouble. I am the 603 number for those of you who are following live on Zoom. With respect to Justice Roberts Justice Owen Roberts in the 30s, I agree with Katie that the case for extending the court now is much stronger than it was back then because of how we got to this point and because of how serious a threat the court has become to democracy itself. I will say, in addition to that, it's worth thinking about the effect of the push to expand the court back in the 30s, even though it didn't actually end up happening. So the reason President Roosevelt wanted to expand the court then is because the court at the time was repeatedly striking down New Deal legislation at the height of the Great Depression. So even though it wasn't threatening democracy back then, it was threatening truly the survival and prosperity of the American people in a huge way. And so when he proposed that expansion, there was an event known to legal history, and I'm sure known to all 9 Supreme Court justices, all of their clerks, and every law professor in America, called the switch in time that saved 9. What Owen Roberts did back then, because he had previously been one of the 5 justices who had been voting to strike down New Deal legislation, during the pendency of that proposal, during the several months when FDR had that live, and there were Democratic majorities in Congress that were considering it, Justice Roberts switched his vote. And remember, this is Owen Roberts from the 1930s, not John Roberts, the current Chief Justice. Justice Owen Roberts, back in the 30s, switched his vote during that time, during that proposal, from striking down New Deal legislation to upholding it. And he never explicitly said that he did that for political reasons, but Supreme Court justices live in the world. They are, although we hope that they won't be political actors, they are part of our political system and they are an important part of it, and they read the news. And so our hope in coming out in favor of Supreme Court expansion is both that will actually happen. And by the way, even if it takes a while, it's really important because these people serve for life. But in addition to that, we hope that these justices, these 6 justices who we have on the court now, who expect to hold this enormous power for the rest of their lives and have this massive 6-3 majority for the rest of their lives, where even if one of those 6 conservatives doesn't want to go along with something, they can still do it. Showing them that there is a movement to restrict their power, to show them that the American people actually care about having democracy set our public policy and not these unelected judges who were appointed by presidents who lost the popular vote and confirmed by senates that lost the popular vote. That is not the way we want our country to work. So putting political pressure on them by showing them the American people care about what they do and will not just take whatever they want because we are a democracy, that is a really important part of this. And so even if it takes a while to extend the Supreme Court, it's still really important that they know that they are being watched and that they cannot just do whatever they want with impunity and with no ethics.
Well said, Doug. And I think just for the nerds on the audience, that was a piece of legislation that was being reviewed by the Supreme Court in 1937 about minimum wage. So it is that those conversations do not go away, and the role of the courts in those conversations do not go away for those that live in Maine and have been tracking those issues for a long time. We have a question here about, I think it's kind of the politics of this is, and understanding that the conservative efforts around the courts have been incredibly effective over the last 40 years. How vulnerable, say the court gets expanded, how vulnerable would an expanded Supreme Court be to the party in power? Is increasing the number going to solve the problem? And could this just make things worse in the future? Both of you jump at once.
Doug, do you want to take that or do you want me to?
Sure, I'll take it. I think the important thing to keep in mind on that is, first of all, nobody likes that we're in this situation where the Supreme Court has been captured, has been packed, has been politicized. That's pretty bad for our democracy in itself. We shouldn't be in this situation. And it would be bad even if the shoe were on the other foot and the other party had captured it and politicized it. But that is not what's happened. It has been captured and politicized. And it's been captured and politicized in a time when our democracy is under assault on many different fronts in all 3 branches of government at every level of government. Thankfully, not with this president and this Congress right now, but still there are more elections coming. There always will be. And the polls are looking good for the other side. We are also seeing that there are many folks who were directly involved in the 1-6 insurrection who are Republican candidates and nominees for major office, for Congress, and for statewide offices, including governor of Pennsylvania. The Republican nominee for governor of Pennsylvania is a 1-6 conspirator. And so in this critical moment where our democracy is under threat and where our court has been captured, we are in the worst case scenario for the Supreme Court already. So the idea that we can just allow the authoritarian anti-environment forces to control the court for the next few decades, because remember, these are lifetime appointments, and many of them will likely retire during presidencies of their own ideological persuasion in order to sustain it further. We can't wait. The court is already in its worst case scenario. So even if we expand the court and then there is some risk, and there is some risk that the other side will come back and expand it again later, the court has already been politicized. The court's legitimacy has already been damaged. So having it go back and forth in that way, which I think is not a foregone conclusion that it would, because it's not easy to do this. It's not easy to expand the court. It's not easy to get a president and a Senate and a House all to agree on that. But even if that were to happen, going back and forth on that is still better than living with this radical right-wing anti-environment authoritarian Supreme Court for generations to come. And when we think about generations to come, I want to think about this. We in the environmental space often talk about how many degrees Celsius we can afford for the world to warm by the year 2050. In the year 2050, Justice Amy Coney Barrett will be younger than Joe Biden is today. So we cannot afford to wait for organically the court to turn over and control. It's going to take way too long. The damage will be irreversible, and any damage that could come from pushing to change the balance of the court has already happened, because the court has been packed by folks who themselves lost the popular vote, cheated to win, and all those other terrible things we know.
Yeah, I mean, I will just add, like, I think, yes, the point is, like, we're already sort of in the judicial arms race. And I think any risk that we take in expanding the Supreme Court is ultimately, like, worth the benefit of expanding the Supreme Court right now. You know, and I think it's important to note that, like, Republicans would expand the Supreme Court at the exact moment that it benefited them to do so, and not one moment later. We have seen that they will break every rule necessary in order to have a Supreme Court that's going to rubber stamp and further their agenda. So I think we have to start fighting fire with fire. We have to start acting with the urgency that they act with.
Thank you so much. This does really seem like either the worst version of the timeline or certainly the break the glass moment for the courts. I just want to end because I think I'm reading a couple of your faces right now, and it seems like some of you may not be able to get out of bed tomorrow morning after this. What's bringing you both hope right now as a way to end? Dig deep for this one if you have to.
You know, I am going to this convention yesterday and today. It's the American Constitution Society convention, and Justice Sotomayor spoke yesterday, and I am one who likes to sort of wallow in the hopelessness sometimes in a really unhealthy way, and Sonia Sotomayor made me snap out of that for a minute, really talking about how transformational her presence on the Supreme Court has been, and how much change for her personally and her life story within sort of one generation. And that definitely did give me hope that things can turn around, no matter sort of how hopeless they feel at the moment.
Thank you for that.
I agree with all
Doug,
that.
how about you? Yeah.
Yeah, so I certainly agree with all of that, and have hope from folks like Justice Sotomayor, who are doing such great work on the bench. I also draw a lot of hope from the wonderful judicial nominations that are moving right now. Joe Biden is doing a better job choosing nominees for the lower federal courts, certainly. Ketanji Brown Jackson is great, but she's one. Joe Biden's nominees for the lower federal courts are truly stellar. Majority women, majority people of color, majority people, lawyers who've spent their careers fighting for the people and not just powerful, deep-pocketed special interests. No president in American history has ever done that before, any of those three things. And the pace at which Senate Democrats are getting them confirmed, despite having the barest possible majority, is really quite impressive. And there are some folks like Nancy Abudu, who would be the first Black woman ever to serve on the 11th Circuit in Georgia, Alabama, and Florida. The head of litigation for the Southern Poverty Law Center is up right now. Dale Ho, who would be the only Asian American judge on the Southern District of New York, the most powerful trial court in the world, is the director of the ACLU Voting Rights Project, and he is up for that court right now. And in the next week, we will see a hearing for a nominee named Rachel Blumenkatz, who, for the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals in Ohio, who is confirmed would be the first public interest environmental lawyer ever to serve on a federal appeals court. And they're confirming a lot of them. They're confirmed way more judges by this point in President Biden's term, even than President Obama had, and even more than President Trump had by this point in his term. That said, there are over 100 current and announced vacancies on the federal courts, and it's really important to make sure that President Biden and Senate Dems get those vacancies filled this year, because if Democrats lose the Senate in the fall, they might not be able to confirm anymore.
Yeah, I'm going to count that as like a happy, that seems happy-ish. I think Katie's is a little happier. And I'll just end on my own. Maybe we could do a happiness sandwich here, which is, I'm fortunate to be married to an attorney, and I have a sister as an attorney, and be experiencing the community here at the University of Maine School of Law. Anthony Maffa, I know many of you have seen his presentations, was just actually over here an hour ago for breakfast, and we were talking about just the caliber of the law students, the diversity of the law students, and just what the legal profession has in front of it is a bright future with the quality of that. We've seen that MCV is proud to host law students as summer and fall and spring fellows, and just we have been blown away by what the legal profession is going to in the next generation. So that's where I drive my hope. Thank you both, Katie and Doug, for today. I'm not running as tight of an hour as Kathleen normally does. But I will say that we are just so excited to be able to do this work with Demand Justice and LCV. We will be off for a couple weeks. For those that are new to MCV's summer lunch and learn schedule, Kathleen and I will take August off, but we have an amazing set of programs in July. Nick Lund from Maine Audubon will be with us on July 8th to talk about his new book, Guide of Birds in Maine. We're going to hear from Bill Harwood, Maine's public advocate, about community solar. And we have so much more ahead of us, including some great stuff about art that I'm really looking forward to. So I hope you join us in July. We will be off for the next 2 weeks again, and we look forward to seeing you. And please take action using the email that we'll be sending this afternoon. And Doug and Katie, thank you both again. It's really wonderful to work with you. Have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you.